Hello and welcome back. So, warning you, this lecture is going to be on the long side. I think I'll keep it, it'll still be under an hour for sure. But this is sort of our first substantive theory of the psychology of morality by Gray and colleagues. Uh, and the title is Mind Perception is the Essence of Morality. By mind perception, they mean other people's minds, mind reading, sort of thing we do all the time. Uh, I can look at you usually and know if you're in pain or not, if you're wincing or jumping up and down or shouting, ouch. Often I'll attribute different beliefs and things like that to you. So it's a thing that humans do. And, they claim that this is the. Okay, so any moral theory is going to abstract a few common themes from a diverse set of moral intuitions. Um, Ethics kind of is based largely, or at least the way we test ethical theories often, is from our intuitions, right? We see an action like murder, cheating, theft, incest, disobedience, and sort of our gut tells us, yeah, that's wrong, right? And we're not saying yet where that came from, right? Maybe you were raised in it, maybe it's innate or whatever, but it is a common phenomenon, right? In the last lecture, when I gave you that list of, things, how much would you have to pay me to stick a pin in a baby's hand, right? You didn't have to think too hard about it. You had an intuition that, yeah, it would be wrong, right, to stick a needle in a baby's hand. So that's what we mean, by intuitions. We talked about intuitions in the last lecture as well. So any theory of moral psychology is going to try to capture all of those intuitions and explain them, and hopefully simplify them with a set of psychological principles, right, that will entail all that data. Intuitions are often the data for our theories of moral psychology. And they compare it to sort of the way Picasso here has distilled complexity of a bull through the series of drawings into what is that, 6 or 7 strokes, right, in the lower right corner there, if you can. So we're trying to take, this large and sort of messy set of people's gut feelings about the morality of various situations and try to streamline them into a small set of principles that will predict that data. So this is exactly what Gray and colleagues are trying to do. And they're going to argue that the basic set of psychological principles that informs our moral judgments has 2 basic components. Intention, right? What was the person's intention in doing the action? And pain. Is someone hurt by the action, right? So an act is judged immoral by humans if it involves an agent intentionally acting to cause suffering to some patient, right? The person receiving the action. So agent and patient are antonyms here. So because, right, the action has to be intentional, that's going to involve perception of other people's mental states, or at least attributing mental states to other people, right? Because you have to determine what the agent's actions were, and then also you have to determine whether the patient is suffering, and that's also uh, mind or mental attribution. They use this word mind perception. Maybe can. I'm not claiming that you literally see into the other person's mind, right? Whatever the mechanism is, right? It might be some sort of inference that's going on in your head, right? You see their behavior, and so you imply some sort of mental state that's going on. They're using the term mind perception, whatever the mechanism is, to say this is, involved when we attribute mental states to other people. All right, so that's the base, right? So that's the basic idea, right? Intention and suffering. So um, go back a little bit to some early studies of moral development in children. Well, many of our articles will go back to Kohlberg, right, who had sort of an account of moral development in children from basic morality of just like they only understand this hurts, right? You avoiding pain and seeking pleasure, up through various stages of learning to make deals with people to get something they want, up to more abstract moral principles. Now, people largely don't believe Kohlberg's approach anymore, but it's form a backdrop. Right? There was sort of a unitary conception of morality as justice, right? We're developing toward the most general form of morality, which is justice. Um, but later studies pointed out that there were actually many differences among cultures, right, in the way they conceived. Um, what do Gray want to do? Well, they do want to say that there is some sort of universal basis to morality, right, that's independent of cultures. Um, and it's going to consist in a relatively simple cognitive template, uh, again, agent causing suffering to a patient, intentionally, but it's going to manifest differently in different cultures, and they hope in that way to be able to explain the differences that we observe between cultures. And this cognitive template is activated when we perceive certain things. So what do they mean here by a cognitive template? Um, so I don't know if you've ever taken a philosophy course, right? You may have tried to define things. That's often what we do in philosophy. Define justice, define knowledge. And once you try to do it, you'll find that it's really very difficult, and not very many of our concepts actually can be captured in terms of what we call necessary and sufficient conditions, right? So take a dog. If you had to define dog, what would you say? A four-legged animal that barks? Well, there's dogs with three legs, right? There's one right there. There's dogs that don't bark. And then a coyote has four legs and barks, but is a coyote a dog? And so on, right? And try it for chair, try it for anything. You'll find it's difficult, if not impossible. Um, but Gray and I'll say, okay, sure, right? Maybe there's not necessary and sufficient conditions, but we do have a concept of a dog, right? Whether or not it's perfect, whether or not it captures every dog, and whether it rules out every coyote, we do have some sort of rough dog template in our minds, and it is more or less something like a barking four-legged animal, right? And the same can be said of moral goodness and moral badness, right? Yeah, if you take an ethics course and you try to define goodness and badness, you'll run after theory, and they'll all have problems, right? And that's why we still and study it, right? It's a tough problem, but that's not our problem in this course, right? So all Gray and colleagues are claiming is that human brains also, like our imperfect template of a dog, we also have an imperfect template immoral action. And that template is what they call a moral dyad, right? Of an intentional agent and suffering patient, right? And if you got those two things, they're saying that's the basics of what morality is in our brains. Now, their concept of mind perception here, right? They talk a lot about mind perception. Again, as I pointed out, if you've taken a philosophy course, or you may have run into the problem of other minds, and it's hard to actually prove to ever know what's really going on in someone else's mind, right? For all you know, I'm in pain right now, but I'm just very good at pretending that I'm not, right? I train myself not to wince or cry out, but although I might be in terrible pain, right? So it is maybe in principle impossible to know for sure what is going on in another person, right? But again, they're not talking about this more general philosophical problem. They're talking about how our brains work, and our brains do have a mechanism for attributing mental states to other people. And we do it all the time. We even sort of overdo it. We'll attribute it to inanimate objects, right? Um, so there's lots of different theories of how this happens, right? Sometimes this ability is called mind reading. Again, it's not meant to indicate you're a psychic. That's just the word used for, again, our ability to attribute mental states to other people, and often to get it right more often than not. You have to be pretty good at it really to be able to drive a car, right? You know when somebody's planning to turn right and things like that. Um, we sort of take it for granted how good we are at figuring out what's going on in other people. And some of the theories of how that works, simulation theory, we won't get into it here. And for the purposes of this article, it doesn't matter. But they are claiming that some such mechanism exists. And it's not a perfect mechanism, right? Uh, but it's something that our mind does, and it's adaptive. We evolved to do that because we're social creatures and we get it right often enough. A useful mechanism. So their further claim is that mind perception is the essence of morality, right? Now, certainly our capacity for mind perception is involved in moral judgment. I don't think anyone would deny that, right? That we care about whether an action is intentional or not, and that involves, right, what's going on in somebody's head. If I um, acts, right, if I'm trying to stop you from falling off a bridge and I grab you and then I accidentally break your wrist, well, you're not going to get too mad at me or blame me too much, right? Because you know what I was trying to do. And that's attributing a mental state or desire to me, right? So yeah, of course, mind perception is involved in moral judgments. But the Gray and colleagues are claiming something stronger, right? Mind perception is the essence of morality. Um, and the idea is when we perceive some action, right, some situation in the world, matches our cognitive template of an immoral action, which is again this moral dyad of an intentional agent causing suffering to some patient, right? When there's a match between what we see and the template in our mind, we say wrong, immoral action, right? So that's the theory, right? They haven't given you any reason to believe it yet. They will give you some evidence and hopefully explain away some of the pretty obvious objections as well, right? There are all sorts of things we deem immoral where no one is necessarily harmed. There's all sorts of situations where you might intentionally harm somebody, but it's still moral, right? But they're going to try to most of those. So, what is some of the evidence? Um, First of all, it's definitely the case that if we believe that someone has diminished mental capacities, that reduces their moral blameworthiness, right? Maybe with a knife. Now, if that baby accidentally cut you, right? Um, or even intentionally cut you, right? Um, we wouldn't necessarily say, okay, we wouldn't blame that baby. Right? Babies aren't morally culpable for these sorts of things because they don't have the mental capacity to be morally culpable. They fail the intentional age. They're not. It's not intentional in this moral sense, right? So that's just sort of an intuitive point, right? Um, there is also a study they did where they surveyed people, where people rated the mental capacity and moral status of various types of beings, and they found actually two relevant dimensions of the mental status: the capacity for the capacity for experience at all, and the capacity for agency. So this baby lacks the capacity for agency, right? Whatever it does with that knife, we wouldn't say it is an intentional act. We probably would say that the baby has the capacity for experience, right? And the baby has the capacity to suffer or be harmed, right? And so we would say it's wrong to harm the baby, even though the baby is blamed for anything it does morally. So these two dimensions, right, that they found in their survey um, correspond, they think, to the two parts of the mental dyad, right? Sorry, the moral dyad. Sufferers have to have the capacity for experience. Right? So a chair can't be a sufferer, pain, and the agent, right, has to have the agency, right? So this seems to be evidence, and this is just a survey of people where they asked them some questions, but they did seem to find these two strands that do map onto their moral uh, cognitive template for morality. So again, as I say, even though a puppy can't be blamed morally for peeing on the rug, right, or um, right for I don't know, what would a puppy can't cheat on a test, right, or something like that. Um, but it is immoral to harm a puppy because a puppy can experience things. So it qualifies as a moral patient, even if not moral. So if the ability to make a moral judgment involves the ability to perceive a moral dyad, right, made up of an intentional agent and a suffering patient, then it should follow that people who have difficulty with mind perception, and there are lots of people who have that difficulty, do. It's not surprising that not everybody is great at it. Um, but if you have a problem with mind perception, you will, their theory predict, have difficulty making moral judgments as well. And they find some evidence for this. So um, autism has been associated with deficits in mind perception, right? A difficulty understanding what's going on in people's heads. Um, so this theory predicts that autism may have trouble making moral judgments, right? And then the converse should be true as well. So if somebody lacks moral judgment, they ought to have problems with mind perception. Um, and so psychopaths are an example of people that have deficits in their moral behavior, right? People like Ted Bundy, serial killers, things like that. So the theory predicts that psychopaths, if you in the lab, uh, should also mind perception. They should have difficulty understanding what's going on in other people's minds, right? So first, autism. Yeah, autism is associated with difficulties in social interaction, and one of the prominent theories of what's going on in autism is people with autism are suffering from mind blindness, right? So they just have difficulty perceiving other people's mental states, right? And again, perception here, whatever the mechanism is, right? If it's theory of mind that you need to be equipped with, there seems to be something in that lacking in people with autism. Um, and studies have shown this, right? That people with autism do have more difficulty inferring other people's beliefs and desires. Um, and if you get more fine-grained about it, you can see that in autism, there are deficits in perceiving agency in perceiving people's intentions, but not necessarily in perceiving that people can have experiences, right? So often people with autism are not deficient in empathy, right? They wouldn't harm a puppy because they understand that that's a something with experience that would suffer, right? But they can have difficulty understanding what someone's intention is in their action, right? Um, and studies do show that people with autism focus on the harms to the patient when they're making moral judgments and they see the puppy getting hurt, focus on that, right? That makes sense to them and they understand that, and they will often ignore the intention part of it. And that manifests in assigning abnormally high blame for accidental harm. So I trip over the puppy and harm it, right? And a person with autism may be more likely to attribute blame to me for that accidental harm, right? Because again, they're having trouble perceiving what the intention was, but they do see the harm. Um, People without autism, you can produce similar results using transcranial magnetic stimulation. So that's just put a strong magnet against your brain, right, and activate it. It basically scrambles that part of your brain, right? And so if you choose which part of the brain you want to scramble, um, you can do that. And so if you pick the brain area associated with mind perception, turn on the EMS, and scramble the electrical activity in that part of the brain, you will start to, right, your ability at making moral judgments will start to be like a person with autism. Right. So the other side of the coin, right, psychopaths who have moral failings, and we want to know if they also manifest with mind perception. Um, they do obviously, right? Psychopaths seem to have a total disregard for the moral status of other people and obvious failure in moral judgment. Um, there are studies that uh, suggest this is the case, right? Psychopaths often don't really understand the difference between the moral norms and social norms, right? They understand that hurting people is frowned upon and you can get in trouble for it, but they don't quite understand why it's wrong. So could this failure in moral judgment be a result of a deficit in mind perception? And some studies suggest that yes, this is the case. Um, and specifically, psychopaths have difficulty with the experience part of the mind perception, right? So they have trouble looking at the puppy or the baby or the other person and seeing them as the type of thing that could suffer. Right? They don't understand suffering in other people, or the total opposite of autism. Um, and psychopathic behavior has been observed in people who have damage to the parts of their brain that are associated with that exact ability, the perception of emotion, right, in others. So this is support again for the moral theory, right? The essence of morality is mind perception, the two parts, the intentional agent and the suffering patient. So all people act immorally, right, in small and large ways. Um, and it's often the case that we rationalize our own behaviors like, well, it's not that bad. A pet peeve of mine, people with their dogs off leash, right? Sure, right? You have such a good dog, whatever, but like everyone else doesn't know, and it stresses everybody out when you have your right dog running around off a leash. So, um, but it's something that a lot of people just do. They rationalize it. Oh, it's okay for me. It's okay for my dog. Right? Um, there have been studies that show that these rationalization of these sorts, um, if there's right, will involve dehumanization of the patient of the immoral act. What does that mean? Well, like for example, studies uh, if they bring you in a lab and they'll give you some beef jerky to snack on, and then ask you to say how much like mental abilities different animals have, and you'll tend to attribute less mental capacity to cows, right, while you're eating beef jerky than if you're eating. Right? Um, Prison guards, executioners, right, people whose job it is to, in some ways, abuse or harm, or at least freedoms of other inmates, they will tend to attribute less mental inmates, right, to other people that aren't inmates. So yeah, it seems like when you act immorally, right, and you rationalize it to yourself, that rationalization often involves, um, right, messing with those components of the moral dyad, right, seeing the other person as maybe not really suffering. Okay, so the moral dyad account of moral judgments implies that morality requires two players, right? You need an intentional agent and a suffering patient. So, for one thing, it seems like there can't be any morality if there can't be immorality if someone isn't harmed. And Haidt, we'll see in another of his papers, right? This is a point that he hammers on, right, against the moral dyad. He says, look, there's lots of types of immoral acts that don't involve harm. His favorite example is suppose that two adult siblings, right, decided to have consensual protected. They're adults and they're not trying to reproduce, right? They're having protected sex, and maybe even afterwards they say, that was fun. I don't feel messed up, or whatever. He gets to stipulate the story, right? Um, and if you set up the story where no one's harmed, then it seems like uh, moral dyad theory should say, yeah, that's fine. Your cognitive template will detect no harm to anybody, and you'll say, right, incest, a-okay. Well, no one says that, right? Everyone, when you describe that scenario to people, and they're like, ew, no, that's wrong. Please don't, gross, right? Um, and the moral dyad theory can't really account for that, right? Well, what Gray and colleagues have to say is that even if it's a situation with no actual harm, what's going in our heads, right, is we're sort of creating a harm, we're inventing a harm, right, and projecting it onto the situation. And that's why it matches our template, right? So maybe we're thinking that they'll have, right, they will, despite the contraceptives, they will end up reproducing and having genetic defects, and that's what's going on in our heads, right? Maybe, right? That's the claim they have to make. Think about it, because on the face of it, it doesn't seem right to match the. So here's a list of a bunch of different types of right immorality that we encounter in the world or that people intuitively think are immoral. And then here are Gray and colleagues' explanations of how these match our cognitive template of moral dyad, right? So first of all, there's obvious harms, right? Kicking a dog. Well, yeah, that matches the template, right? There's someone who intentionally harmed someone another. Um, but there are other types of immorality that are less obvious. So fairness violations, right? So maybe I break a promise to someone, right? Um, well, Gray and colleagues say, yeah, that causes harm, right? It's not physical harm, right? It's not like kicking somebody. But if you promise to say, help your friend move, and then you flake on the day of, well, that harms them in a number of ways, right? They may feel emotionally hurt. They'll also have to pay for somebody else, to pay for movers at the last minute, or like carry all the stuff themselves and expend energy. So they claim there's harm involved there, right, in fairness violation. Other situations, other sort of like types of things we deem immoral that aren't maybe obviously uh, matching the moral dyad. Uh, in-group loyalty violations. So, say a group, right? So I put you in a group assignment, right? And the three of you have to put together a PowerPoint, and then one of you just free rides and doesn't do anything. That's something we would call immoral, probably, right? Well, where's the harm, right? For Gray and colleagues, there has to be some harm. Well, the harm is, the other members had to do extra work, and kind of harm, right? Maybe they suffered in their other classes because the extra work they had to do for this class, right? So on, their relationship. There's lots of ways you could think of harms that might happen from that in-group loyalty violation. Number four, authority violations. So disobeying leaders, right? Particularly in some other cultures, a little less so in Western cultures, it's very immoral, right? Disobeying your people in authority. And where's the harm? Well, according to Gray and colleagues, the harm is that these authority structures are there for a reason to preserve peace and order, right? And so when you violate, uh, right, the authority, right, when you disobey authority, you are creating the potential for violence, order, or whatever the is meant to avoid. Right? And finally, we've got purity violations. So that incest example would be a purity violation, right? Um, Culture, untouchables in other cultures, right? In some cultures, like doing certain things with your left hand, right, would be purity violation. Um, so with in the incest example, they have to find harm, and they say, well, the harm you're kind of projecting onto there, but it's harm to their potential children, right? And they say even if, yeah, in the scenario you stipulated that they're using protection, we're still going to project the harm on there, and it's going to match our cognitive template. Even victimless acts, right, can be perceived as immoral, right? And so, according to Gray and all, we have to find a victim, right? And they say, well, even if there's not obviously a victim in the situation, our mind fills it in, right? So, homosexuality is considered by many people to be immoral, right? I don't think it's immoral, right? But it's in the history of the world, people thought it was immoral, right? Um, so, what's the harm? Who's being harmed, right? When two adults, right, decide to have sex with each other, even if they're the same sex. Um, well, they say, opponents of homosexuality will say it's harming traditional family life or it's harming children. They'll find someone that it's harming, right, and project it on there. There's other examples like in Tibet, malicious gossip is claimed to have some sort of magical effect that will harm the person that you're gossiping about. It can damage their health, right? So, again, a seemingly victimless crime, right? If I gossip about you, but you never hear about it, right? It seems like who's harmed? Well, the example just is like the power of the psychological template, right? We'll fill in a magical harm, right, if we have to. Other examples, so sometimes, if you prime people with descriptions of harmless actions like flag burning, um, people who think flag burning is immoral will rate subsequent descriptions of actions like stubbing your toe is more harmful. So the point being, if you prime them with something they think is immoral, that triggers the harm template, right? And they're looking for harm, and they're rating stuff as more harmful. A connection between immorality and harm in people's brains. So if harm is, in fact, a part of our concept of morality, then all of our thoughts about morality should bring harm to mind. If that's the nature of the concept, then it's a whole big question how they are. But one approach to concepts, like, yeah, our concept of right bad, evil is about someone harming another, and so every time I think about evil, I think about harm. Um, well, this might be a problem. Not all thoughts about harm. So, if harm is part of the concept of morality, then any thought about immorality will bring up harm, but not every harm will bring up immorality. Right? We're not saying that morality is part of the concept of harm; it's the other way around. So, subjects primed with moral words that don't always entail harm, like unfair or impure, right? These are the kinds of morality that aren't obviously involving harm. Uh, if you prime people with moral words, they will be faster to identify the word harmful, suggesting that the harm concept is activated when you activate the morality concept, even in situations when there's no actual harm. So far as I can tell, they I would think the reverse, right? So prime people with harm and see if they should predict that they are not quicker to recognize morality, right? Well, they didn't test it, right? Maybe if we read the actual original papers, we might find that. Okay, so again, Gray et al., right? Their theory predicts that acts that involve harm are the prototypical immoral acts. Here they're sort of talking about a prototype theory of concepts. Again, we don't have a lot of time to go into theories of concepts, um, but one idea is that like uh, your idea of like a fish, right, is just sort of like an average fish. It's the central tendency. Um, so if harm is the prototype, right, then murder is going to be considered worse than talking back to your parents. Why? Because harm in murder is obvious and huge, right? Just talking back to your parents, arguing with your parents, it's not clear what the harm is. You have to think a little bit for the harm, right? So it's not going to seem as bad, right? So how morally bad something is going to correlate with how harmful it is, right? Harm is the prototypical immoral act. And they've demonstrated this experimentally by asking people to spontaneously name immoral acts, right? And um, the most prototypical ones will come to mind first, right? Because that is the concept basically is that average, right? Um, so it's going to be things like murder, rape, theft, right? That's what people do say first, right? And they tend to be the more harmful things. And less than, when you just say name some immoral things, less than 10% of responses um, will be actions that have sort of minimal harm or it's hard to find the harm, right? So homosexuality is not going to come up very often. Gossip is not going to come up very often. Nepotism, right? Which is like when you favor nepotism is like I hire my cousin for a job or something instead of the better candidate, right? Those things, it's not obvious off the bat what the harm is, and people are less quick to name those when I just say name some immoral stuff. They name the harmful stuff first. Okay, so again, it's not obvious. They do their best to explain them away, but there are so many immoral acts or acts that people typically consider immoral that don't obviously involve harm. We considered the one, right, the consensual incest one, and they explained it away by saying, well, we project harm onto this. We say they're going to bring with genetic defects. But there's lots of other exceptions, right? So, for example, sometimes in some cultures it has been seen as moral to harm someone, right? So there have been cultures where honor killing has been considered the moral thing to do. If someone is raped, people will kill the rape victim. That sounds horrible to us, but there are other cultures throughout in the world and in history, and they have their own morality. And in some of those moralities, the moral thing to do is to kill somebody or to harm them, right? That seems to uh, right? That seems to not work with the moral dyad theory. Well, Gray and colleagues, they have to have an explanation of this, right? They say, well, in these cases, right, the brain does find the harms, right? And they're focusing on the harms to the family, right? Because of this, right? The damage to the honor of the family is considered like a harm ultimately than killing the rape victim. Again, sounds like a terrible thing, right? But this is just what has happened in some cultures at some points. Um, In some cultures, a rape victim is unmarriageable and thus a financial burden, right? Often, people in these cultures are dealing with levels of poverty and things like that that's hard for us to understand, and so it's sometimes um, hard to judge. At any rate, right, they say, look, there's a way to explain, right, why this makes sense in our moral theory. In situations like infanticide, right, or another one, and there might be certain times, certain cultures where it's considered a moral thing to do, right, to kill a child, and they will explain it away in terms of greater harm to other people. That's going to be great approach there. Maybe you find that satisfying, maybe you don't, right? When you find claims that they're having to make their theory work, where you're like, I'm not sure that that works. maybe it's a paper topic. Talk about it in the discussion board and see if it's something you want to work into a paper. Again, purity violations can also be harmless, right? So, there will be religions that say it's immoral to eat pork, right? Or another example in our culture, cooking and eating a dead skunk that you find in the road, right? You might think, oh, if that's terrible, that's bad, but, it's not obvious that there's harm, right? And of course, they're going to say, well, um, it's rooted in a feeling of disgust, and the point of disgust is sort of an instinct that evolved to keep you from eating stuff that's going to make you right and getting sick with bodily harm, right? So you're right. If you think that eating a dead skunk is somehow immoral, or if you're in a culture that thinks that eating pork is immoral, probably rooted in the potential for illness, right? And that is a harm. So it works with their theory. Right. Well, if the moral dyad is our template for morality, then they predict that we're going to try to fill in that template as incomplete. And this can happen in two ways. If we find somebody that we deem morally blameworthy, we're going to look around for a suffering patient, right? And if we find someone that's suffering, we're going to look for someone to blame. And they find that this to be the case experimentally. So subjects who receive electrical shocks will rate the shock as more painful when it's presented as intentional rather than accidental. So I tell you it was intentional. Okay, now I'm looking for more suffering, right? If I tell you it's not intentional, then I'm not looking for a suffering to complete the dyad. When subjects received unfair results in a computer game, they tended to attribute this to intentional rigging by the researchers. So here we have the suffering, we have the harm, right? I lost this game and I lost, and I look for an intentional agent. This might be part of the basis, or at least in the supernatural, right? If your crops fail, you want somebody to blame, right? And the rain god, someone who cursed your fields, right? Moral typecasting is another phenomenon associated with this moral dyad theory. So uh, we will tend, people are complicated, right? And they're not always just an intentional harmer or a suffering person, right? Some people are a bit of both. But we're going to want to tend to fit people into one of the two slots, right? So if someone is perceived as a wrongdoer, as an intentional agent, we have trouble also viewing them as a suffering patient, right? And so people will rate wrongdoers as less susceptible to pain. And then also, if you frame yourself as a victim, as someone who's suffering, we all know that's an effective rhetorical strategy for avoiding blame, right? Um, and surprisingly, good doers are also rated as less sensitive. And if they're in the agent role, then they're not going to be in the patient role. It's kind of one or the other. And counter to this point, however, there does exist the phenomenon of blaming the victim, right? So, right, someone is harmed, right? Someone is raped, and people will say, "Oh, well, you shouldn't have been out at night. You should have been wearing stuff." So this doesn't seem to fit the moral dyad theory at all, right? People will suffer, and we will still heap blame on people who are suffering. So they need to do a little more work to explain that phenomenon. Morality is mind perception. They think explains the communal aspects of morality. So many analyses of morality emphasize its social function. Right? It allows us to have larger and larger communities. The more and more abstract and general moral rules we have, the larger societies we can build without it collapsing into people stealing and killing each other. Right? You need a general sanction, no stealing, nobody's doing any stealing, right, in this country, no lying, kind of thing. If you have a large, stable social group. And mind perception, they argue, is also necessary for social groups, right? You need to understand what other people believe and desire in order to interact with them as rational agents. So it makes sense the two would evolve in tandem, right? As we form larger social groups, we need to keep tabs on what other people are thinking and what other people are feeling, and also our morality is going to evolve with that using that same mind perception tool. Um, Also seems to coincide with primitive religion, right, which also evolved at a certain point, in which supernatural beings are starting to be blamed by certain types of suffering, right? And God is seen as having these supernatural powers of perception, being able to see right into your heart. All these ideas are floating around as society starts to get larger and larger. Perceived character matters for moral judgments. So they find that people will judge a bad action as less bad if it's done by someone they consider good, right? So if you were a Democrat or a fan of Bill Clinton, right, then you might have thought that his, right, that his extramarital sexual activities were not that bad and not something you should be impeached over. Whereas if you didn't like him so much, um, and this they argue is because intentions are part of the moral dyad, and if we think someone is of good character, we're going to attribute better intentions to them, and so we're going to be less likely to blame them. They're not going to fit into our template. So this sort of unifies these distinct factors of morality, how it's useful in communities, and also how we tend to focus on character as important to morality. All right, we're getting towards the end here, I promise. So the moral dyad develops out of three more primitive templates, they think, cognitive templates, right? Our causation, right? Our concept of causation, how we sort of project causation onto events in the world, our perceptions of intention and pain, which we've talked about a bit, and our empathetic aversion to other people's pain. This is sort of a pretty primitive thing. When you see someone in pain, it sort of hurts you. So even among non-mental objects, take billiard balls, there is a kind of agent-patient relation, which is the cause-effect relation. Right? There's the cause is the agent, and the effect is the patient. So this is a very basic, at a very young age, babies start to view things as cause and effect related. Um, then later, right, we have this theory of mind that gets supplements it. We start to view the humans and their intentions as causes, right? So intentions sort of unify these various ways of producing the same effect. Kicking, hitting, or shoving another person can all bring about the same effect, but you've got a single intention behind it. Now, it sort of unifies all these different causes under a single higher level intention to bring about some. But there's lots of instances of intentions having effects. Not all of them are moral, right? So I have every day I have intentions to do things, right? And I carry those out. Not many, a lot of them don't have any particular moral valence, right? And that's where the pain comes in. So we know we don't like pain in ourselves, and we don't like it in others, right? And again, even very young infants are uncomfortable around people in pain. This is just a very thing that humans have, and so right, you add this negative valence of pain, and that's the final right ingredient that says, okay, yeah, we have our intentional agent, we have the pain of someone suffering, now we have morality. So this is sort of like the ingredients of how the cognitive template evolved from simpler cognitive templates. So some new predictions. So much of this is a little bit backwards looking, right? They're looking at the evidence and saying, look, our theory will make sense of all this evidence. But we like scientific theories that make bold new predictions, right? When Einstein predicted that objects that are moving faster time will slow down for them, and then right, we okay, let's test it. We actually flew a very precise clock around the Earth and it came back right a little bit slower than the Earth clocks. Bold prediction, right? Brand new thing, never tried it before, and hey, it worked, right? So that's the hallmark of a great theory is if you can make a novel prediction, it turns out to be true. So they want to try to make some novel predictions. Um, One is that differences in moral judgments among people should correlate with differences in their perceptions of intention and suffering, right? So if you did a study like that, um, uh, that could be, and it turned out that was the case, then that would be support for the theory. The moral dyad also predicts that certain emotions will be compatible and others are not, right? So if someone is morally typecast into the patient role, then we should not feel anger towards them, right? And if someone is typecast into the villain role, we shouldn't feel sympathy for them. That's another thing you could do a study, right? Okay, that's the last slide, right? Um, that's their theory. I'm interested to see in the discussion what you folks think of it. Here's a few sort of like possible objections or things to think about, right? Um, so they've done their best to try to explain cases of things we find immoral where it's not obvious that there's any harm or suffering, right? And they've tried to explain that away and say, well, we project harm onto the situation. Um, are they successful in every case, right? Are there cases where that approach is plausible? Another question, right? They've done a lot of explaining of immorality, but they haven't said much about morality or moral goodness, right? Does their moral dyad make sense of moral goodness, right? Uh, could they explain it using that moral dyad? Are there problems for trying to use the moral dyad theory to explain moral goodness? They haven't really mentioned much about self-harm, right? So here, the agent and the patient are the same, I guess, right? Is that something that could work with the moral dyad, right? Can they explain why most folks would say it's immoral to harm myself or kill myself? Um, and they mentioned a little bit, but there are so many situations where we consider it good to harm someone, right? We go to the movie theater and when, right, the good guy just like shoots the bad guy or beats him down, everyone cheers, right? Um, how do they explain that adequately? Um, anything else? Any other thoughts or objections? I'm curious to hear what you think. So, that's enough of me, and I'll look forward to your posts in the discussion.